so ostensibly we were here to talk about like silence. And my thought originally was silence is a particularly interesting thing to talk about right now because I feel like the last couple of months have been very noisy for all of us. I don't know if that's been your impression, right? But I've been doing a lot of like youth groups and sort of young adult groups and whatever it is. And I was on a youth group meeting a couple of weeks ago, and this one kid, he was like 16, 17, I forget exactly. And he's like, I never thought in my entire life that I would be sick of my phone and so like longing to go back to church. Like there's just been a lot of noise as a result of just kind of the state of the world and being stuck at home, right? Raise your hand if you shotgunned Tiger King in like a day. I mean, there's like so much Netflix, so much whatever. There's just been like so much media that we're pouring into our brains. There's just been a lot of noise. And I think a consequence of a lot of that has been weird mixtures of boredom and anxiety and loneliness, right? I kind of feel like a thing that I've seen a lot as I'm talking to people, and something that I've experienced myself as well, is just kind of a weird, complicated mix of negative emotions. Like I live alone, right? I haven't like had a lot of like face-to-face contact with people in a while, except from sort of like social distancing. Like I'll go to my mom's and she'll be on one side of the yard and I'm on the other side of the yard. And like, you sort of like shout at the person across the way. But it's just been a weird time. And I think if anything, right, the last few days have made things even weirder. Like somebody, like if you chart out, like you're a pretend dungeon master for those who play Dungeons and Dragons, right? If you were a dungeon master charting out 2020, and like 1 month was the month when Australia was on fire, and the other month was the month when like the virus was going to kill us all, and now is the month where like everybody just like is angry about, right? Like there's just like so much stuff that's been happening in 2020. And I don't mean to make light of what is happening now, particularly because there's just this sense of injustice, and there's this sense of frustration, and there's this sense of anger, right? And then there's this sense of fear, and like there's just like a lot of emotions that have been happening over the course of the last few months, which makes a person like me very uncomfortable. I don't know about you guys, like I come from a Greek family where theoretically everybody wears their emotions on their sleeves, and like they talk with their hands a lot, which I definitely do, and they raise their voices a lot, as I sometimes do. But I tend to be very non-confrontational. I don't like emotions. Emotions tend to make me very scared. Like when I was a kid, I was the sort of kid who liked sitting in the corner reading the encyclopedia, because at least like knowledge lives in a laid out template on like a piece of paper. And like to the question of, when did George Washington cross the Delaware River? There's an answer. And when did, Columbus cross the ocean blue? There's an answer. But there's not often a lot of answers or control when it comes to feelings. So they scare me. Like feelings have just scared me for most of my life. I'm being very honest and vulnerable right now. And I think the last couple of months have been an opportunity for more feelings of frustrations, right? Like anger at the bishops. The bishops are closing churches, and anger at the politicians, and anger, like just like everybody's angry and frustrated at somebody. And we're all like Grandpa Simpson in The Simpsons. We're just like shaking our fist very vigorously at something or someone, which is hard. I've been reading this book, which is a collection of sermons by Elder Emilianos of Simonopetra, which is one of the monasteries on Mount Athos. And he has this very powerful line that I read a couple of weeks ago, and that's been resonating with me. And he's like, do you think you love God? If you love God, you will be able to pray to him without distraction. If you aren't able to pray without distraction, you have a sense of what you actually love, and you have a sense of what is actually distracting you. And at a time when all this media is pumping into our eyes and into our ears, when all these emotions are churning into our hearts, like, I don't know about you, but if I ever try to take a moment to just kind of like sit in the few seconds between Netflix like auto plays from one episode to the next, and I have kind of the moments podcasts where it is, and there's an opportunity for me to hear the inner monologue that's going on within me, like it's always connected to something. And for me, it's always like frustrated about something or dwelling upon something, right? Like I'm angry about something, or I'm desirous of something, or I'm resentful of something. Like there's all these things that I find myself kind of like attached to. And Elder Emilianos' thing basically is like, if I can be kind of like bold about it, like that's kind of the idol around which your attention and your heart really connects. You know, you try to close your eyes, you try to like maybe sit and say your prayers. If you're good at saying them every day, fantastic. If you say them every once in a while, whatever it is. But when you take that moment to just kind of collect yourself, instead of placing yourself in the presence of God, you're placing yourself like in some sort of like fight or attack or something that's just been sort of like bothering you. And this thing that's just kind of gnawing at you on the inside. You know, he says like, those are the passions. Those are the things that grab us by the nose and pull us every which way except towards God. That the heart that's going to able to actually, the heart that actually loves God is the heart that's able to stand before him without distraction. And for me, that's kind of a scary thing, because I realize like just how many things have been distracting me, especially over the course of the last couple of months. What do we do with that? You know, how do we, at a time of like anxiety and frustration and deep feelings, at a time when we're constantly sort of getting dopamine hits because we're spending all of our time on phones, where we're spending all of our time in front of screens and these sort of like flickering lights that are providing distractions, right? That are constantly taking our attention from this point to that point, never actually allowing ourselves the opportunity to rest. I think for us as Christians in particular, but like as human beings, I think this is a time more than ever where we need to rediscover the importance of silence. Why is silence so important? Because as I said before, like those who are able to sit in silence, like that is a mark of spiritual maturity. Like if we're able to actually like close our eyes and place ourselves in the presence of God, we know that that's where our heart is directed as opposed to something else. Because there's two levels to silence, right? There's the outside silence. There's the TV constantly on. There's the podcasts that are constantly going, but there's the inner silence too. You know, I don't know if you've noticed this, right? Like I realized this for the first time when I went to Mount Athos many years ago for the first time. I grew up in New York. I live in New York still. I'm used to the honking of taxis. I'm used to the rumbling of subways. Like my life is very noisy. I remember the first time sitting on a little bench overlooking a monastery, the sky above me, the sea below me, a monastery on a cliff ahead of me. And I heard nothing but the sound of the wind in the leaves, which is like the most silence I've ever heard in my entire life. I'm not a nature guy. I didn't do hikes or whatever it is. Like this was, and I have this moment of like awe. And then I have this moment of realization as all the inner dialogues that are within me begin to percolate to the surface. And I wasn't distracted by the sound of the taxis, and I wasn't distracted by the sound of the subway or the sounds of the airport or the sounds of the bus or whatever it is, right? There was nothing on the outside. And for the first time in my life, I actually heard kind of the inner voices and the inner monologues and the inner arguments that we sometimes have about ourselves, the inner arguments that we sometimes have about other people. Just like stuff, unresolved stuff that was percolating under the surface, but if we don't make time to close what's happening on the outside, we can't actually address what's happening on the inside. Like, I don't know if you've ever done that. If you've ever had the opportunity to just like sit by yourself and mute the physical world around you and actually listen to kind of like the state of things within. You know, because there's constantly like monologues and dialogues even sometimes, right? Because we can be fractured on the inside. There's that, you know, you look at yourself in the mirror when you're getting ready for work, and there's that voice like, I'm not happy with what I see, you know, or there's maybe like an opportunity where somebody offers you a compliment and there's that little voice in the back of your mind, which is like, I'm not sure that I believe that. Like there's all sorts of stuff that are constantly percolating under the hood. Sometimes literal voices, right? Sometimes just kind of feelings, but there's all sorts of stuff that's happening there. And silence is one of those ways that we kind of strip that away. You know, the tell us, 46, be still and know that I am God. That there's something about silence when we kind of like put these distractions away, we put away our ideas, we put away the things that we think about the world, and we approach the world for what it actually is. Like there's something about silence. There's something about actually like not coming face to face with our own imaginings, our own ideas, but who the Lord actually is. Something that's real and not imaginary. When the outer voice and the inner voice go quiet and we kind of come face to face with reality as it is, when we come face to face with the Lord as he actually is. There's a beautiful story that you might have heard in the book of 2 Kings. It's like the prophet Elisha, right? Prophet Elisha, you've probably heard of before. He was the successor to Elijah. No, sorry, Elijah, I should say. Not Elisha, Elijah. Holy prophet, right? You've heard of Elijah, chariot of fire at the end of his life, like holy guy. I don't think any of us are being taken up into heaven in a chariot of fire at the end of our lives. Like this is a primo supremo holy figure. He was the one who had this like epic face-off with these idolatrous priests. If you ever read this thing, like there's the priests of Baal, who's kind of a demon, and they challenge Elijah and they're like, your God isn't real. And Elijah's like, aha, I'll prove it. So they literally have like two sacrifices side to side, and the priests of Baal pray to Baal and nothing happens. And Elijah prays to the Lord, and thunder and lightning come down from the sky and ignite right? Like proving that the Lord is God. But not too long after this, Elijah gets into like a fit of despair. Elijah gets into a fit of fatigue and loneliness, and he climbs this mountain and he calls out to the Lord and he says, Lord, it is good that I should die. Like you have this very existential crisis from a person who literally raised his hands to heaven and called out to the Lord, and lightning came down in response to his voice. This guy, just like a couple of verses later, Lord, it is good that I will die, because all of this is futile and whatever. And the Lord says, have a snack and have a drink of water, which he does, which helps sometimes. And the Lord says that he's going to come to Elijah. And three things happen as Elijah is on this mountain. There's this great earthquake, which the scripture tells us like shakes the mountain to its core under his feet. And there's this great wind, which breaks all the rocks apart. And there's this great fire, which burns and cracks and splinters everything. And yet the scripture tells us that God wasn't in any of those things. God was in a still small voice, which came to Elijah while he's there on the mountain. And Elisha hears the still small voice and he covers his face because he realizes like, this is the Lord. This is the one that I've been seeking. And I remember the first time that I came face to face with this, being really surprised by this story. Because I think for so many of us growing up in this culture, you think if God is going to speak to us, it's going to be like the voice of Morgan Freeman coming down from the sky. Like the clouds are going to part and thunder and lightning and trumpets are going to blast, right? And you're going to get this very sort of baritone, like, this is the Lord, right? But that's not what happens. Three very in your face, grab you by the ears and just kind of shake your skull things happen. This fire, this wind, this earthquake. And the Lord's not in any of them. He's in the still small voice. And of course, what do you need in order to hear a still small voice? You need silence. You know, if you were to come to New York on New Year's Eve, and if I was to take you down to Times Square, which I would never do, I would never inflict anything like that upon you guys. I like you guys too much. But we're there with like 5 million people, right? Who are, they're doing the noisemakers and they're wearing the glasses with like the, you know, the zeros for the holes and the whatever. And everybody's like screaming at the top of their lungs. And I can't, right? Like I wouldn't be able to just go, this is wonderful. This is a ripping good celebration. Happy New Year. I apologize for turning this into like an ASMR demonstration. That's not what I meant to do. But you can't do that because like there's too much noise happening for you to hear a still small voice. And I wonder, right, with all of the physical noise that we've been pumping into our brains over the course of the last couple of months in particular, because media use has gone up, right? And we're just like spending much more time on devices. There's noise. Our lives are full of noise with all of these emotions that we've been feeling over the course of the last couple of months. The loneliness, the anger, the confusion, the frustration, the whatever, like emotions that have actually gotten more heightened in the last couple of weeks in particular. That's noise. That's noise. You know, I think like as there are definitely times when we need to speak. There are definitely times when, you know, you go back and you read Genesis and you read the account of Cain killing Abel, right? And God talks about like the blood of Abel, which is calling from the earth, right? There are times when noise is appropriate. There are times when things will call out. And just as human beings, as individual human beings, like there's also needs to be a time for silence every now and again, because without that silence, if our lives continue to be full of noise, both physical, external noise and inner sort of noise, we're never going to hear that voice. We're never going to hear that voice. You know, and the voice of the Lord is peace. I think it's no accident that we become a society that has become really, really expert at pumping noise into our lives. And the better that we've gotten at that, the more inner turmoil we seem to feel. You know, I contrast my life and the anxieties of my life and the frustrations and the confusions of my life with like my grandparents, who could just sit there in the garden and just feel the wind on their face, and they were super contented. And like me, I'm jittery and like I get these phantom buzzes in my pocket, right? Was that my phone? That was my phone. That was my phone, right? I got to look at my phone. You know, you have those moments when you're talking face to face to a human being. Somebody is like sharing something to you and you just have that itch. And without even being aware of it, sometimes like you reach down into your pocket and you get your phone and you're just sort of like, you detach from this living, breathing icon of God that is staring right in front of you and is sharing something great that happened during their day or something terrible that happened during their day. And you're just far more interested in like scrolling on Instagram or whatever your social media platform of choice is, or checking your email or your texts or whatever it is. Like we have this desire for noise, and the more noise that we fill ourselves with, the less space there is for the voice of God, and the less space there is for the voice of our neighbor. You know, I feel like one of the fundamental problems that we have as a society is a lack of presence. Like we're never here. Like even when I'm with you and I'm staring you in the face, part of my attention is always like, I wonder what's trending on Twitter right now. Or I wonder if I got any emails from work recently. Or that very familiar interaction when we're like having a dialogue, but I'm not actually listening to you speaking. I'm just kind of formulating my thing that I'm going to say when you're done. Like when the hole in the front of your face stops moving, that's when I get the chance to actually share what I want to share with you. Which I think explains a lot about the way that we shout at each other and the way that just like actual conversation seems to be harder. Like I remember, like even a few days ago, like I had a really good interaction online. I waded into, you know, one of these political debates, and to my great surprise, right, I said something and then somebody said something reasonable back, and then I said something reasonable back, and we actually had this like very civil back and forth. And I was like, I can't remember the last time this happened. I can't remember the last time somebody said like, that's a good point. Have you thought about this? And actually like listen to the point that I made. And then I listened to the point that that person made. And I was like, what about this? Like I do a lot of media stuff. I spend a lot of time in YouTube comments, which is definitely not good for your mental or emotional health. Like those tend not to be the way that we interact. But like there's no room for the other in a heart that's cluttered. And there's no room for the Lord, the still small voice of the Lord in a heart that's cluttered. I just think we're really cluttered. At least that's my perception of myself, and that's the perception that I get from a lot of other people as well. We're cluttered. And now more than ever, because like the world has gotten really, really loud on the outside. And I feel like the world has also gotten really, really loud on the inside for a lot of us as well. This is the time to figure out how we can kind of turn down the volume a little bit. And if we're able to successfully turn down the volume, we might hear the voice of our neighbor. We might hear the still small voice of God, which I feel like we need at this particular time more than ever, potentially, because we're in Act 6 of a 2020 that just an insane dungeon master has laid out for us. Right? Like 2020 has been such a crazy year that murder hornets were like a thing for a couple of days. And then like, they just like, you know, the rest of the season, like that wasn't even the big thing of this season. Not to pull an Abed from Community and think about the world as a season or whatever, but I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense. That's my thought today. If we can clear a little bit of the clutter out, we can have room for the voice of our neighbor. We can have room for the voice of God. So that and my loaf of bread are all that I wanted to share this evening.
I have a question.
Yeah,
this is Maya.
Hi, Maya.
It's interesting the word silence can also mean something very different right now. People that are staying silent are not looked upon as someone who's in prayer. What insight do you have about that?
What was that word? Not looked upon as someone who's what?
That's seeking prayer, or, you know, just the fact that what's going on in the media right now and with the Black Lives Matter, the people that have stayed quiet, people have also noted that being quiet is a symbol of you being racist right now. So that word quiet, when you were talking about it, it just, it could have such parallel meanings.
Totally.
Right now.
That's a really good,
especially right now.
Yeah. That's a really good question. And so I teased it a little bit when I mentioned, you know, you have the description of Cain and killing Abel right at the very beginning of Genesis, which is a sign of like how quickly mankind gets itself into like just a mess, right? You go from don't eat this fruit, I ate the fruit, to homicide in the space of, right, like 2 pages. And when Cain kills Abel and Abel's blood soaks into the soil, right, the description that you get is this very powerful, like the blood in the soil like cries out, right? So I think there are moments for noise, right? There are moments for having a very kind of like public, like here's another example. Jesus spent a lot of his time quietly, right? Like one thing that we see about Jesus again and again in the gospel accounts is the way that he withdraws from the crowds. Like there are even times when there are people who are there and they're like clamoring for healing and they really want to see him and they really want, like they've got something that they want to bring to him, and he withdraws and he goes and he'll spend hours, the night, whatever it is, in prayer, right? So there's that. And also when he marches into Jerusalem, getting ready for Pentecost, right, that week, if you go and you read the account in Matthew, I think it is in particular, because it's slightly different in some of the different accounts, but I think it's like in Matthew and Mark in particular, he comes into the city, he goes straight to the temple, and he starts overthrowing the tables of the money changers, right? Because he feels this like righteous anger and he can't be silent about the way that these people are turning the house of his father into a house of commerce. So there are moments for voicing something. There are moments for crying out for justice. But there's also kind of like a practice of silence that's necessary too. And I think the reason that those are necessary to go hand in hand is this. Emotions aren't bad, right? Emotions aren't bad. Have any of you ever seen Inside Out, that Pixar movie? So without getting too deep, like spoilers for those who might not have seen it, like one of the interesting lessons from the movie is that none of the emotions that are in Riley's head is bad, right? All of those emotions, like because there's 5 of them. There's joy, there's sadness, there's anger, there's disgust, there's fear. All of them are there to keep Riley safe. All of them are there like for a good purpose. Even the sadness, right? Even the fear, even these things that we might not be comfortable with are there for a reason. And like they're actually, like there's a good behind it when it's there in the proper place. It's possible for us to get sad about the wrong things. Anybody who has ever interacted with a child knows this, right? Because there's a child, right? I've got a lot of nieces and nephews, and you will see the way that like when the little wheel falls off their toy, it is the end of the world, and like no greater atrocity has ever befallen the human race. Right? Or if like a little kid doesn't want to eat their broccoli and wants some like, it's the worst thing. This is worse than genocide, right? This is what it is to be like a little soul that hasn't been properly formed and get sad at the wrong things or get angry at the wrong things, right? And yet when Jesus walks into Jerusalem and he goes straight to the temple, he's clearly angry. He pulls out a whip and he starts whipping people and he gets them out of the temple. Anger's not bad. It's a clean heart. It's a virtuous soul that's going to be angry about the right things, that's going to be sad about the right things, right? That's going to be angry at injustice, not angry at the things that affect me personally or selfishly, right? Not because I didn't get candy, right? It's going to be angry about things that matter, sad about things that matter because of my love for my neighbor. And that kind of goes hand in hand with that silence. Like silence is one of those things that helps create a clean heart within us. And I think that when it is a spiritual practice of ours, it puts us in a better position to speak about the things that we need to speak about and to be angry about the things that we need to be angry about. So to say that Christians need to be silent is not to say that we should never, ever speak out about things. You know, St. John Chrysostom got himself exiled 3 times. He wasn't technically martyred, but he was being marched to death when he died. He was literally like he was being marched to death. He was this frail old man that they were marching for like 12, 14, whatever it is, hours a day until he just kind of collapsed and died. He got exiled because he dared to talk about the injustice of the empire. And he dared to talk about the way that the emperor and the empress were misusing their power and hoarding their wealth and oppressing people, right? Like that's what got him. It wasn't theology in the abstract sense that got him exiled. You know, St. Basil did not make a lot of friends when he gave those sermons on social justice. You know, he said like, there's this really powerful one that you've probably heard quoted before, where he says like, if you have 2 pairs of shoes, and there's a person outside who doesn't have any, you're stealing from that person. If you have 2 loaves of bread, you're stealing from the person who's hungry. That didn't make him a lot of friends. But I think those statements, the statements of Chrysostom, the statements of Basil, came from a heart that had peace within it and a heart that was formed by silence and knew when not to be silent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
It was a good question.
I have a question. This is Allie.
Oh yes, of the hide and go seek before.
Of the peekaboo, yes.
Yeah.
So my question is, kind of building off of that, there's so much going on right now. Where do you find the silence to hear? Because there's so many differing opinions going on that you're in the middle of the earthquake right now.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you find that silence? Or how do
Yeah.
you hear that voice? Which voice?
That's a good question. There are a lot of voices that are out there right now. Not all of them speak the truth, right? There's a lot of social pressures that are upon us as well. Because sometimes we don't want to like rock the boat. Sometimes we want to fit in, right? I mean, like part of being a human being is that we're pack animals, and we tend not to want to say things that are going to get us in trouble with the rest of the pack, right? I think that this becomes, and it's hard now in the midst of this, right? And like, and on some level, I get it. Like, I get the impulse to say, if you're not like speaking against injustice, you're complicit. Like, I get the rationale behind that. I totally get the rationale behind that. I also think boundaries are important. And like, if you're not there yet, if you're not there where you have kind of like an opinion that you want to share or whatever it is, like, that's also okay. I mean, it's hard, it's tough. I mean, like, we're kind of like, there's like, again, there's like all these kind of like social pressures, but if there's anything I've learned over the course of the last couple of years, like, you're responsible for one heart at the end of the day, and it's your own. And it took me a long while to kind of like learn to say this as a human being, because I'm not terribly confrontational about stuff. But just to be able to sort of like draw a boundary about yourself and say, like, I'm not comfortable with that. Not yet. Right? Not now, possibly not ever, depending on the sort of situation. And that's okay. And that's okay. My friend Christian and I, we recorded a podcast yesterday about everything that's happening out there. Like, I'm kind of at a place where I don't have like 100% like fully formed opinion, but I had some instincts and some thoughts that I felt comfortable sharing, and so did Christian. So, and that was okay with us. Like, we shared them. But if you're not at that point, like, that's okay, because I think if we let social pressure, oops, it froze again. Sorry. I don't know where it was when it froze.
You got if we let social pressure, and then you cut out on us. I don't know if that helps.
It does. If we let social pressures dictate, right, that actually, if anything, I think creates more inner turmoil for us. Like, it's hard. It's like, I don't know, like, I have these very strong recollections of being in like grade school or middle school, and everybody is sort of like saying something or picking on this one kid or whatever it is, and like, you have this pressure to sort of like make fun of the kid that everybody else is making fun of, or like none of that is healthy. Like, it's not healthy to sort of like have your inner temperature being shaped by people around you. Like, I think it's okay to say, I need time. I think it's okay to say I need time. And especially like if you haven't gotten to the point where you have kind of a sense of where you are and what you believe, like, this is like a really tough time to figure that out, because all these voices are kind of like louder and more amplified. Maybe this is a time to disconnect from the news for a couple of days. Maybe this is a time to just like spend 5 or 10 minutes a day just kind of by yourself. Like, go stand or sit wherever your icons are, and not even like saying prayers, right? But just kind of just be for a couple of minutes a day. And we can talk about sort of like exercises that are helpful in terms of clearing your mind and so forth, but just kind of just to be present. Yeah, it's hard. it's hard to make up your mind in the midst of a lot of these pressures. If anything, like this outside pressures potentially like becomes even that much more resistant to listening. Like if it's an idea that is imposed upon you rather than an idea that you kind of like come to, I don't know how genuine it is. I don't know how open it is to like actual dialogue and listening, right? It becomes kind of like this thing that you're backed into a corner about. I think like these big questions that America is wrestling with right now, like questions of race and questions of justice, and I think they're matters of life and death. They're matters of anthropology. They're matters of like what we say humanity is. Like they're big questions and they're important questions. And I think it's important that we all do wrestle with them. But it's also important that we do so kind of like at our own time, at our own pace. And if you're not there at a point where you have an answer right now, like that's okay. I think that's okay. And if you need to take a couple of minutes from the news, and if you need to sort of like unplug for a little while, like I think that's okay. I think back to Jesus, right? Like there were people in the crowds who had diseases, right? Like they were there to be healed, and yet he would still withdraw and spend time alone with his Father because it was that important, right? If like the guy who created you, who knew, right? Like there's a guy out there who's got something wrong with his back and it's been hurting him for years, but I'm not going to get to it right now, right? Because like it is important that I spend time with my Father. I think we can spend a little bit time with our Father as well. Does that make sense?
And I know,
I guess
no, go for it, Andrew.
I was just going to say, I guess you kind of have to find peace with yourself before you can really find peace with others, especially in times of higher conflict. And so just that internal dialogue, the internal noise, I find like even driving, I don't know, with New York, it might not really translate fully, but if you're driving in Houston, you're on the road for a little while, and you may turn on the radio just to have background noise, even if you're not actively listening to something, just to almost avoid that internal noise. And so I guess to find that kind of peaceful silence, you have to try to get out of your comfort zone and almost confront it and just gradually acclimate to find that silence.
Yeah.
Speaking from personal experience, I guess.
I think the example of driving in a car is fascinating. Like if you think about it, this has actually become the default, right? Like I noticed this with like any like relatively new car that I get into. New is in the sense of like the last like probably even 10 years. You get into the car and like the car will automatically like start the radio or start some sort of noise for you. Like the default, right? The sort of accepted default is that like, no, of course you don't want to be quiet. Like heaven forbid, if you're by yourself, you're going to talk to this other person. No way. Like radio, or you're by yourself. No way. You're not going to actually spend time in silence. Like that's the default. And it takes some effort to move against that default. But I think there's real dividends that come from it. There's real dividends that come from it. And I think it's important, right? Because like even now, because again, like there's a lot of opinions that are being bandied around. And I think it's interesting if you kind of like take a moment to parse them. You can see that sometimes opinions are based in a negative emotion in its own right, opinions that are based upon fear, opinions that are based upon, fear, honestly. I feel like one of the dominant political motivators is fear. Like we're afraid of all sorts of things. We're afraid of change. We're afraid of violence. We're afraid of our safety. We're like, and when we're motivated purely by those things, that tends not to put us into a good place in terms of like positions, in terms of empathy, in terms of, perfect love casts out fear. fear is probably not the best foundation upon which to build a political philosophy or a life philosophy or whatever it is. It's not to say fear is bad. Fear is a natural emotion, right? But fear has to be managed just like other emotions. And that takes time, and that takes work, and that takes sometimes something as simple as like, you're going to be in the car for half an hour a day. Like, use that as a time to just be with yourself, to know yourself, right? To know God, to try to put yourself in his presence. Yeah.
I was kind of just, you touched on it a couple answers ago, but I was going to see if you wanted to go more in depth on it. I know you lead a silence workshop, especially right now. I'm sure that's been huge. What, I mean, I don't know if this is oversimplifying it, but is there just one of your favorite practices that you found works for you, or something that's pretty effective?
In terms of trying to cultivate that silence? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, I think it's pretty straightforward. I'm trying to think of the best angle to take about this. I mean, I guess I could kind of like, not to do it, but just to kind of like walk you through kind of like some of the basic steps. It starts with finding a quiet place. Your car is quiet. Your room is probably quiet. I wouldn't suggest, trying to be quiet on the middle of a trading floor in a stock exchange, or, while you're watching the Rockets play or whatever it is, right? That's not the place when noetic stuff tends to happen. James Harden is dropping 50 and everybody's like freaking out. Like, that's not where you're gonna, right? So first, find a quiet place. Put yourself into a posture that's physically comfortable yet alert. I think you'll notice if you try to get into the practice of silence, there's a fine line between like silence and sleep. Being silent can be uncomfortable, and sometimes when we're uncomfortable, the body tends to withdraw, and sometimes we do that by falling asleep. Like, have you noticed this? Like, sometimes you have a bad day and you go home and your first instinct is to take a nap. Right? Like, part of this is the brain like dealing with memories and sort of like sorting things out internally. Like, part of it is like very physiological, but part of it also is like, it's a coping mechanism. Like, I don't want to be here right now. So like, it's like Troy and Abed, if you ever watch Community, whenever they were in an awkward situation, like, pretend you're asleep, pretend like you're asleep, right? It's just a way of distancing yourself. So be comfortable yet alert. And then when you try to create silence on the inside, you will notice that your mind is going to be wandering and your heart is going to feel all sorts of different things. Think of your attention like a bird. Like, if you've ever been in a building, sometimes in the airport or kind of a warehouse or whatever it is, and you've seen a bird that's loose in a building, like, it's just going to fly wherever the heck it wants to. That's what your attention is. Your attention is like the dog from Up, right? It's like whenever the squirrel goes by, squirrel, like, that's just your attention is just all over the place. So it's really, mastering your attention is really about sort of gently extending your hand and taking that bird and trying to put it into a cage. So it's like here in one place as opposed to going all over. And the easiest way to do that, in my experience, is just by focusing on like one thing. The mind is not built for multitasking. And sometimes I think the easiest thing that you can do is simply focus on your breathing. Like, we can even do this right now. Like, you take 1 million breaths a day, not literally, you take a lot of breaths a day. How many do you pay attention to? Right? Like, take a deep breath right now. Take a deep breath in through your nose, and just notice the temperature of the air as it enters your nose. Right? Like, that is a sensation that you're normally not paying attention to. And if you take another deep breath, you can actually begin to follow the air like back into your sinuses, right? Back into your throat. You take another deep breath and you're following that air. You can actually feel that air as it enters your nostril, hits the back of your throat, begins filling your bronchial tubes. You can feel it beginning to fill up your lungs. you can actually sort of like track the course of this air in and out of your body. And it becomes kind of like a cognitive hook. Because if you can simply sit there and like focus your breath, focus your tongue on the experience of, you have less mental space to worry about what that person said to you at work. You have less mental space to worry about the things that are making you anxious or whatever it is. Like your attention is just kind of focusing on this one rhythmic, simple, cyclical thing. And that's kind of the beginning of peace. You know? And the thing is, if you can do that for a couple of moments, a couple of minutes, whatever it is, and just kind of sit there and be, right? At some point you realize like you're not even thinking about anything. You're just breathing. And if you've got a little bit of that stillness within you, that's where prayer can go, right? If you're going to practice the Jesus prayer by yourself, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, that's the place to do it. Or if you're going to say your prayers before your icon, like that's the place to do it. As opposed to your mind is thinking about whatever, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread and forgive us our trespasses, right? As we sometimes pray. But you clear things out, you gently grab your attention and you bring it in. And that's the place where work can actually happen. And I think it's like, again, it takes work to get there, but it starts with something as simple as noticing that like, there's nerve endings on the inside of my nose and I can feel air. I can focus on the act of breathing. And I can focus on that and let the other things just sort of fade away. So it starts pretty simple.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. We sit in silence all the time. Yeah, we totally do that. Yeah. We all sat here like.
Yeah, and it starts small, right? And here's another thing that I really enjoy about silence. Like even if it's just 30 seconds, right? Here's the cool thing about silence. Here's why, like for all you youth directors out there, right? The cool thing about silence in particular too, right? Like we feel these anxieties, the kids that we work with feel these anxieties, right? Like there's a performance anxiety that's upon us. Like you've got to get the right grades. You've got to get into the right school. You've got to make the starter on the team. You've got to get the right extracurricular activities. You've got to do your chores. You've got to, like, there's all these you've gotta's in our lives. And I think for a lot of us, right, we can sometimes struggle with the sense that like, maybe my parents won't love me if I don't get the grades that they expect from me, right? Or maybe my friends won't love me if I don't look a certain way. The kid who wakes up and looks at him or herself in the mirror and isn't happy what he or she sees, right? Like there's a lot of things that like we have these bars that we set for ourselves, like physically, you know, popularity wise, like our clothes have to be the right way, whatever it is. We're always doing something to earn love or earn esteem. But when you're silent, you're not doing anything. And it is there when you're not doing anything that I think you can probably more fully than any other point experience the love of God. Because that's where it's unconditional. I don't care what grades you get. You're sitting here doing nothing, and nothing is good enough for me. I don't care how your makeup looks. I don't care how your jump shot lands. I don't care what college you got into. I don't care how you did on your SATs. I don't care what job you have on the side. Like you're here doing nothing, and nothing is enough for a Lord that loves us unconditionally. And that's why I think there's this incredible experience of peace of just being there. Because it's like our own ego sort of gets out of the way. And that's the time for the Lord to act. Do I want to go there? I'll go there.
Go there. If it's a question, go there.
I'll go there. So there's this saying that you might have heard. It's like an Orthodox saying. If you die before you die, then you won't die when you die. Right? Have you ever heard that sort of like very convoluted saying? It's like a monastic saying. If you die before you die, then you won't die when you die. What does that mean? This is where death and the concept of like death to ourselves and death to the world, right, becomes this interesting sort of ascetic thing. Because a lot of our times in our lives, we're struggling with this illusion that we have to struggle for holiness, we have to do this, we have to do that. But where does God meet us? God doesn't meet us when we get the 100 on the test. God doesn't meet us when we're emotional. God doesn't meet us on the throne of kings. God doesn't meet us in the boardroom of CEOs. God meets us in the tomb. And the one thing that we all share as human beings is this moment of death, this moment of like absolute powerlessness. Because when you're dead, you can't do jack. You're just there and you're rotting. That's all you're doing. And that is where the Lord acts. Because that is where, for the first time in most of our lives, our ego is finally out of the way. And it's not us calling the shots, but it is the Lord who can finally act and like raise us from the grave. And this is where that concept of like die before you die, because humility, obedience, right? These things that sort of put our own will to death are the things that in kind of a spiritual sense put us into that grave. And it's no longer like my will and my plans and my ego and whatever it is, right? But like the simple and the humble and the contrite heart is already in the grave and is not self-directed, not egotistical, not looking out for itself, not stealing so that it could eat, right? Not looking at the world as this sort of competition, kill or be killed, nasty, brutish, and short, whatever it is. It's the Lord acting through the life of the holy person, because that holy person has already died to himself. And the holy person has already laid everything on the line and is in a spiritual sense, has already laid in the grave and been like, Lord, do as you will with me, right? Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And silence is a piece of that. Silence is like, look, I'm getting out of the way. I have no words to give you. I have no actions to give you. It's just me with all of my flaws, with all of my passions, with all of my addictions, with all of my whatever. It's me. And I lay myself, like I throw myself totally at your mercy. And that's where the Lord begins to act, because we have finally gotten out of the way. So that's why I think silence is so powerful. Silence becomes this point, this like taste of death, in the sense of like, I have stopped so that he can begin. I don't know if that makes any sense.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's uncomfortable for us all. Something we kind of have to just deal with at some point, and we'll learn. Like you said, slowly, the slow process, step by step.
Because it goes against everything we're taught. You're supposed to have a plan. You're supposed to have a plan for retirement. You're supposed to have this, right? You're supposed to have a backup.
You're supposed to have a backup plan to the backup plan.
You know, and it's like it's a very different thing to because like Jesus tells us this, right? Like like all those stories that he talks about humility, right? Like look at the sparrows of the field, right? Look at the lilies of the field. Solomon himself is not arrayed in such finery. Like that's what that means. Like get out of your own way and let the Lord act within you. You know, there's that very famous moment in the life of Saint Seraphim of Saraf where he's talking to one of the novice monks that he's with, and the monk talks him like, he asks him something along the lines of, is it possible to pray always? What is it like to pray always? And the saint turns to him and he says, if you do so, you will become like fire. And he holds up his hand, and there's like, we've got Pentecost coming up, right? And there's like a tongue of fire, like coming out of each finger, right? And he has died to himself so much that he is infused with the light and the fire of Christ to the point where you can see it, right? The halos that we see on the saints, like that's not their light, right? That's their own noxious whatever has been put out so the light of the Lord can shine through them, because they've died before they've died.